Hello, hello, and welcome to Results Washington's Reflection Series. This is an interview series that highlights continuous improvement efforts with the enterprise happening across the state, as well as spotlighting the individual subject matter expert of those efforts as they share their perspectives and experience throughout the project. We hear about all kinds of things like their achievements, barriers faced, and lessons learned along the way. I'm Talia Mazzara, and I'm a Senior Performance Advisor with Results Washington. Today, we are so fortunate to speak with Allyson Brooks with the Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation, and she is here to share about an awesome project ensuring equity and environmental justice with the identification of cultural resources across Washington state. Thank you so much for being here with us today, Allyson.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, we are happy to have you here. So, first things first, I always like to kick us off with asking you to tell our listeners a little bit about you, what you do, and what your office is responsible for.
I'm Dr. Allyson Brooks, and I'm the director of the Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation, and also known as the State Historic Preservation Officer. That is a title given to me by the federal government, actually. Um, my role and the agency's role is to identify important historic places across the state, and those can be historic buildings, archaeological sites, cultural sites, sacred sites, and then to help transportation and land use planners with avoiding or minimizing impacts. So, in essence, our role in many ways is balancing project delivery with the avoidance or protection of cultural resources. We also have other programs. We list historic sites on the National Register of Places. We also list and when I say historic sites, I mean the gamut of what I had just said, right? Historic buildings, archaeological sites, we'll call them historic properties. So we list historic properties on the National Register of Historic Places. We list properties on the Washington Heritage Register, and we also have a historic barn register, which is very popular indeed. We try to really preserve and protect our historic places as much as possible. But again, we know that projects have to go forward. So we're always trying to balance project delivery with the protection of these resources.
Awesome, thank you. Off the top of your head, do you know how long your office has been in? Um, yeah, how
So
long it's been around?
technically, under federal law, our office was established in 1966.
Okay.
But I believe in our state, we really didn't get going till around the late or mid 1970s. And
Ah,
then our office was under state parks, which is interesting. And
mhm.
eventually, due to the workload and the regulatory aspect of what we do, we became an independent state agency.
Oh, nice. Very good. Okay, well, without further ado, let's hear about this wonderful project, if it has a name, and then we're just looking to hear what problem were you trying to solve and why was this issue important to address?
There are two projects that came together. The first under the National Park Service, we were to more time and a little more consideration in identifying what we call the historic properties of underrepresented communities. And underrepresented communities means that they are communities that don't have their properties listed on the National Register of Historic Places because they've been overlooked. So we applied for quite a few grants. We don't get funding directly. We have to apply for it from the National Park Service. We applied for two studies of Latino properties, one starting in the Yakima Valley and the second one in Seattle. Then we applied for a grant and got it to study Filipino American properties.
Mhm.
Then we did Black Heritage, and we're still working on Black Heritage, actually. We are also in the middle of a grant called the Chinese Exclusion Period, and we're trying to identify archaeological sites, actually, that represent Chinese railroad workers and where they were. And our latest grant is to examine the history of LGBTQ plus in Puget Sound. So again, when I say we're studying, we're looking for historic buildings and archaeological sites and cultural sites, and those properties that are important to those groups. Now, on the federal side that I just talked about, in order for something to be considered historically significant, the property has to be 50 years old and it has to have architectural, what's called architectural or archaeological integrity,
Yeah.
meaning it has to look like it did during the period of its significance.
Okay.
And sometimes that could be a high bar. So we decided to do another project in Seattle where we threw out the federal criteria and even the state criteria and said, let's just throw out all the criteria and go back to communities in Seattle as a pilot project and say to the communities in Seattle, what's important to you? We're not going to ask you criteria. We're not going to give you the 50-year rule. We're not going to give you the 4 criteria we have to work under or the state criteria. We're just going to say, what's important to you? You tell us, and then we're going to map it. And then we'll map those places, give a small little few sentences about why they're important, and make sure land use and transportation planners know where these places are. So what we did was we reached out to the Black community and the Asian American community and the LGBTQ community and all sorts of different groups in Seattle and said, just tell us what's important to you historically. What happened there? Why do you think it's important? And then we mapped it. And that way, if there, for example, if there are transportation projects in Seattle, transportation planners or land use planners will know those buildings or sites or landscapes are there. And then planners should try to avoid those sites as much as possible or protect them.
Wow, wow, wow. Okay, a couple of questions.
So, so Talia, just really quickly, it's basically sort of flipping things upside down, right? So the
Yeah.
federal and state government says, here's how you have to set the criteria for making something significant. And we said, let's flip this and say, we're just going to ask you, right? We're going to do something completely different. You just tell us no criteria.
Yeah, and that was my question because I thought, when I had originally heard about this, I remember hearing, taking the requirements down, but I still saw that 50 years thing around. And so I was thinking, okay, well, that's like the one requirement that has to stay. So what I'm hearing you say is off the table, took that off, and we just really want to hear what's important. That's amazing. That is really amazing. And okay, well, oh gosh, I'm getting ahead of myself. It's exciting. Wonderful, wonderful. Okay, so that's how you solve the problem is you really just kind of flipped it on its head. It sounds like you changed
So
the
I was
going about
actually
it.
sitting at the Panama Hotel with Representative Sharon Tomiko Santos,
Mhm.
and she was talking about Representative Santos was talking about her frustration that sometimes transportation and land use planners aren't really taking historic sites seriously or looking for them.
Mm.
And we just sat there having tea at the Panama Hotel. And if those of you who aren't aware of the Panama Hotel, it's very historic in the International District. And in the basement of the Panama Hotel are the luggage of the Japanese Americans that left their belongings behind when they were sent to internment camps,
Wow.
expecting that people would come back to get their luggage, and no one ever did. So that luggage has been sitting at the bottom of the Panama Hotel for decades. It's very, very famous. So we were sitting there having tea in the tea room, and we thought, well, that's where we came up with the idea of let's just do something different. Let's do a pilot project in Seattle and just ask everybody in Seattle what's important to you instead of having this criteria. And it was interesting because people were really surprised, especially the LGBTQ plus community said, oh, we hadn't thought about anybody asking us what important, buildings or sites are historically significant and represent the history of our state. So that's how that came about. And if you ever have the chance to visit the Panama Hotel, you should. It's very moving, very emotional, and tells a story in itself of what happened to our Japanese American community.
Oh, that sounds like an awesome place. I'm wondering when you did this and when you got that feedback, did anything that come back to you kind of surprise you? Since now you're hearing from folks on what's important to them without the requirements, did you hear about sites that you weren't
It's
aware
not so
of?
much a surprise.
Mhm.
I think it's more letting planners understand that more recent events are still historic and we should still consider them.
Yeah, very good, very good. Did you notice when doing this? This is definitely a continuous improvement project. But did you notice as you were doing this were there any type of lean methodologies you were trying to implement, any type of waste reduction you were trying to do, or it was just about improving the process and improving?
It's improving the process by letting the public tell us
Yeah,
instead of government, right? If we in government always want to tell the public, well, we want to hear from you, but here's all the rules you have to follow, right?
yeah,
And so we're improving the process through dialogue and saying, you know what, maybe people should communicate with us differently. And
yeah.
so, Talia, you are correct in the sense that we did develop a easy to use form. So
Mhm.
the original National Register form is very complicated. So
Yes.
yes, we developed what we called Survey 123, which you could just use on your phone or your tablet, easy to answer questions. What's the address? Tell us why this is important in a few sentences. Super simple. Anybody can pick it up and use it and really get away from all the minutia of government.
Yeah, yeah, it sounds like it. Yeah, I saw pictures of that and that looked like a neat little application that you created. And then also, including the voice of the customer is super lean as well. You can't do lean to people. You've got to include them and hear their voice. And so how often do we see projects that just are given from the top down and directed from the top down, but you're not really including the people that it impacts. So that's awesome.
Yeah, I don't even
Okay,
see them as the customer. I see them as we the people. We the
right.
people are telling us what's historically significant and what we need to take care of.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for calling that out. All right. Well, let's see. You already answered that. What would be the next step in your project or your agency's plan with these ideas going forward?
Well, we still have to finish our Chinese exclusion grant. We have to finish our LGBTQ plus grant. We're hoping to continue Black Heritage for another 2 years. And just keep going with different communities. The Filipino American grant came out about because I just sat next to somebody at a meeting and she was asking me about Filipino American heritage, and I realized I didn't know enough. So I applied for a federal grant so I could learn more. And sometimes, it's sort of serendipity in the sense that when you discover you don't know something, you better go out and find it.
Yeah.
And so, coming forward, we're trying to learn more about all different types of resources out there that maybe we haven't originally thought of, particularly when it comes to also covenants, right? Seattle had 44,000 covenants that didn't let, let's see, it was Blacks, Asian Americans, and Jews, known as Hebrews, they were known as Hebrews,
Mhm.
buy property in certain parts of Seattle. And
Mhm.
so we're also trying to tell that story of many historic places that started out as Jewish buildings and became used by the Black community, the Asian buildings particularly in the Seattle area, the central area of Seattle and the international district, because these communities were pushed into those neighborhoods by the fact that people weren't allowed to buy property in other neighborhoods. So
Oh,
that's part of the history in terms of teaching with places that
mhm.
we're looking at. And the most important thing overall, Talia, is we really want to teach with places
Mhm.
because similar to how I just talked about the Panama Hotel,
Mhm.
you really evoke emotions when you teach with places because you're standing or you're there in a place. Another good example is the Eagle Ferry dock landing from Bainbridge Island, where the first Japanese Americans were forced to leave Bainbridge Island and go to internment camps. You can stand on that ferry landing and get that emotion and get that feeling.
Oh, for
So
sure.
what we do is preserve the places that give you that feeling of history.
That's wonderful. I'm just curious, do you have a place on your website where maybe you can share your website here, but a place on your website where folks can go and see all the sites that you've helped to preserve? And it sounds like you've done a whole lot and you're just sharing a few with us, but it sounds like you have done a lot. And I'm just thinking people need to see this.
So we actually have information on over 650,000 buildings. So
Mm,
you can go on our website. It's at dap.wa.gov, dahp.wa.gov, and it's called the Wizard System. and you can play around on that on a map, and there's points, and you can click on any point and up will come a photograph and information about that site all over the state. What we don't let the public have is information on archaeological sites or cultural places because people tend to loot those.
Mm,
So those are protected and they're behind a firewall. But all the buildings are open information for anyone to play with.
nice. Thank you for that. Just another quick question that I had off the top of my head, and it's okay if you don't have this information offhand. But just out of curiosity, do you have any numbers off the top of your head as far as when you think of specific communities that you, like you said, you're delving into the Filipino community now, but you've looked at, but you're still working with the Black heritage, but you've looked at, sounds like some Japanese culture, and I'm just curious if you have any that you have like numbers off the top of your head of how many sites for certain communities you've worked to preserve.
I wouldn't say we have numbers because we're still working on it. I mean,
Uh,
a lot of the surveys we've done are, we only get $50,000 from the federal government to do this work. So it's a very limited region. A really good example, again, is we did a survey of Latino properties in the Yakima Valley. We did one in Seattle, but we haven't touched Skagit County, and that's another big area that we need to look at. So we are a long ways away from learning all there is to learn about Washington State.
oh yeah. Well, yeah, you've got me curious because already that sounds like there's so much culture and history here, rich history that I would have never known about. So this is actually a really exciting project to teach me about Washington history. Thank you for that. Okay, so what would you say in doing this? What was the biggest challenge that you faced during this new improvement effort? And
The
yeah,
challenge is just people are surprised when we ask the question. They're like, "Oh, we want to hear from you. We're not telling you."
oh,
And it's getting, I think it's the public getting over that hurdle of we really want to know. We're not the deciders on what's important. We're asking you to tell us. And that it wasn't really a hurdle as much as sort of even as the public, oh, I have to redirect my thinking.
hmm. So that's not that bad of a challenge, just a little bit of an observation, right? So
Oh.
nothing, you wouldn't say there's any barriers that you had to overcome. This was a pretty smooth sailing project.
I think the barriers are just finding the right communities to work with and the right people. No, I think it's been a good project. The barrier is probably just funding. I hate to say
Yeah.
it, like everything else, right? Having enough funding to get all this work done. And that's the biggest barrier.
Yeah. Yeah. Makes sense. All right. Well, do you have any lessons learned in working with this? And what would be the biggest lessons
Yeah,
learned?
the lesson learned is, it's important to ask we the people and not always for government to tell the people what's important. So,
Awesome. Thank you for that.
yeah,
Okay. Well, folks, you heard it first from Allison. Thank you so much, Allison. I love hearing about this project. I'm excited. We're going to hear more about it at the PPR this Thursday. So for those of you who want to hear more about awesome projects going on around the state, September 26th, we are having a public performance review with the governor, where we're going to talk about Allison's project. We're going to actually see some visuals that she's going to share with us of maps and different properties and sites that they've helped to preserve. And we'll hear about a lot of awesome projects there as well. So thank you so much. We really do appreciate you for staying with us today. And
thank you
yeah,
for
so
having
awesome.
me.
Oh gosh, this was an awesome
Appreciate
project.
it.
So I'm happy you came to spend some time with us. All right. Thank you. Have a
Thanks.
wonderful day.